I would like to mainly just speak, but my slides are just to add on what I'm saying. So sometimes it's very difficult. People get attached to the slides and what I talk, but I would love that you listen more to what I'm going to say because you can get the slides at a later stage. And really, although this subject talks about EDCTP, it is talking to all of us. And it is my wish that at the end of the talk or the discussion, we have a feeling that we are in this together, and everyone who subscribed to this seminar is an interested party in one way or another. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So you have a role to play to improve this African clinical trial ecosystem. And the question will be, how do we best do that together to move forward? So Africa, as you know, it is really a very beautiful continent. But when we talk of global health or burden of disease or its contribution to burden of disease globally, it is a horrifying picture. It's 20% of the world population who are carrying 25% of the disease burden. And yet, when we look at what is recorded on how clinical trials or how much clinical trials are done from the continent, it's a meager 3%. And, this disease burden is really terrible. The statistics, although I didn't put it there on the slide, but like 70% of all the 34 million HIV cases are in this continent. 25% of the 10 million TB cases worldwide are in this continent. 95% of the malaria cases of the 250 million globally, they are in this continent. 40% of the 600 million neglected tropical diseases are in this continent that need treatment. 1.5 million of our children don't finish immunizations, and that puts at risk about 30 million of other children at risk of infectious diseases. So that's the picture we have, and but I think it's nice now that we can have a full picture of what has happened in the last 20 years. So the picture is not really of doom and gloom, as you can see. This is the latest statistics from our clinical trials community that Louis talked about at the at Science for Africa Foundation. And you can see they have plotted here the top 20 countries conducting clinical trials. And as you can see, from 2003, it was probably just, I think it's Egypt or some country like that. But as you go towards 2021, there's more and more countries participating. Of course, the big chunk of clinical trials being done in two countries, Egypt and South Africa. But the picture has been improving. And this to us is really important because EDCTP was established, as you'll see in a short while, in 2004. And as we have been increasing the number of clinical trials in our portfolio, so does the picture increase. And so it is a substantial contribution, but still a drop in the ocean. Now, how did we get here is a question. And that question cannot be answered without looking back 100 years or more, what really happened in Africa. So what we know as the history of clinical research was started by the schools of tropical hygiene and medicine following the voyages of discovery. So the establishment of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, the Institute in Antwerp, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They set up centers in Africa where they can do studies to protect the populations that are going on colonial duties, but also coming back to Europe. And that was the opportunity And there are centers that we know have existed through the last 50 years or so through these efforts around Africa, and they still are contributing enormously, and they are also the centers of attraction of helping and building capacities in other centers around Africa. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. But what is it that probably was not done right that made us to have this meager contribution in clinical research? I've just highlighted a few issues here, but there could be more. But this historical approach really overlooked the stimulation of African ownership and leadership in this activity. It also overlooked the development of clinical trialists in large numbers from Africa. And there was also an overlooking of continental-wide infrastructure development. So there was these centers that were developed East, South, and West Africa, but ignoring the whole part of probably what we know now as the endemic diseases source in Central Africa. There was also a neglect of ethics and regulatory capacity development, and mapping of disease to match them with clinical activity was limited. And so we have hotspots of diseases where there's no capacity at all to do anything in fighting them until they come to centers where countries where there's capacity. And there was last but not least, overlooking of South-South cooperation, which is very important. Africa is also a union, and it needs to have a strong coordination in the South, which is also a platform for good North-South cooperation. But that, as I've explained, you see that it was very, very selective in nature based on the countries that the voyagers found favorable to do their work. And this is an example, and so recent, of what that kind of marginalization or polarization does. You know, in the 1990s, when the HIV investment or research was mounted so strongly, these authors mapped the HIV collaborations as of 2006. And what you see in this picture is that first, the lead authors are mostly, although the disease or the research is done in Africa, but they're mostly Western and sometimes good enough in countries like South Africa, but also that in between them, and this publication estimated that only 5% of the publications have South-South collaboration. So everyone who sits there in Uganda just works with people in Europe or America and forget completely their next door neighbors. And their next door neighbors are doing exactly the same. And so this is just a picture to show you how the old system, when perpetuated, can lead to just more fragmentation when more and more resources start to come. So there needed to be a program that does things differently. And EDCTP, in my view, is one of those programs. There are a couple others. But during this period, 20-year period, EDCTP is one of the programs that was established to break this paradigm. And we have had EDCTP now in 3 phases. The blue phase is when we started, and I joined EDCTP in 2004 when they started here in the Africa office in Cape Town. And that phase was EDCTP1, and it finished in 2014 and closed in 2015. And in 2014, there was another program called EDCTP2, which will finish in legally this year, but technically in next year or 2026. And before that, there's been an overlap of EDCTP3, as you can see, which will end up to 2030. And what is the aim of this program? The aim of this program was really to help put in place a clinical trial program that responds to the needs of providing interventions in terms of drugs, vaccines, diagnostics for infectious diseases that affected the African continent more, so as to build global solutions. And we started with TB, HIV, and malaria in 2004 with a small fund of 400 million from the European Commission. And then after successful implementation of that program under 3 diseases, the program was expanded to more infectious diseases in EDCTP2, as you can see, with a bigger fund of 1.3 billion euros. And the program that has started in 2022 to end in 2031 has a budget of 1.6 billion euros, but also including other new challenges such as antimicrobial resistance, climate change in there, and One Health. So it is a program that is evolving according to need and the changing pattern of disease, environment, and human interaction. And I'll talk more about that later. But just to show you the countries that are now covered by this program, you can see that most of sub-Saharan African countries have, in one way or another, participated and gotten grants from EDCTP, 44 African countries, in partnership with 19 European countries. So it is a big partnership. And the questions sometimes are, what about other continents? Not yet. So we haven't had the mandate to go as further as South America or Southeast Asia, etc., etc. Although those countries are, some of them are partners in EDCTP programs, and when they do that, they bring their own resources, which is also a bonus to Africa. So usually when I reach there, people ask me, so what have you achieved with all this coverage? Let me just quickly take you through some of the achievements. So you can see here in kind of numbers now, for example, in the last 10 years alone, this is the absorption of clinical research projects per country. Of course, South Africa, as you can see, takes the biggest chunk, 132 clinical trial projects funded in South Africa in the last 10 years. But you have countries there that are competing favorably, like Tanzania, 80, Uganda, 86, etc., etc. So there are weaknesses also to learn from here, this kind of picture, because this gives us a focus on where we should have more efforts and leverage. For example, as I said, you can see here in Central Africa where there is lots of epidemics. This is probably where we need, and also part of West Africa, we need to pay special attention when it comes to epidemic research. Of course, HIV and malaria are strong in the other areas, like East and South Central Africa, Southern Africa, but the same may apply to West Africa. So it's really a continuous journey of looking together what we can do to change this picture. But let me just take you very quickly through some of the products, the key products that this program has produced. So as you may rightly remember that in our training in the 80s, 90s, mainly in the 90s and early 2000s, when you have a child who has HIV, our specialists would tell us to weigh the child and then according to weight, decide how much of the other tablets the mother has to break to give the child based on weight. It helped. It's not very scientific, but it went on for quite a while until EDCTP funded some trials in Zambia and Uganda to produce dosages of children, or what we call pediatric tea formulations that are baby friendly. They taste nicer than the other tablets, and the kids love them, and they make administration a little bit easier. And these are now AMA and FDA approved, right? And they are in the programs like we know them, PEPFAR, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, when we talk of mother to child transmission, this has been a very big advancement for us and very big contribution. The other one is and Professor Mark Nico at the University of Cape Town was the investigator of this, was to how to best use GeneXpert to diagnose TB better. So he got a grant from EDCTP, and now we know that WHO recommends GeneXpert as TB diagnostic tool that reduces the period people have to wait for their results from 3 days, sometimes weeks, to just 30 minutes or 1 hour, depending on the clinic time. And so this is another product that we are very proud of. But there has been also quite in EDCTP1, especially these Pyramax studies that produce Pyramax as anti-malarial in areas where people get repeated malaria, to show what kind of efficacious drugs you can use without making resistance even worse. This has been really very instrumental in places like West Africa, where the studies were done in Mali, Burkina Faso, and these are also EMEA-approved formulations. Now, as you know, that HIV co-infections still are ravaging, and one of the biggest killers of patients with HIV is meningitis. And it could be TB meningitis, but the most lethal one is the fungal meningitis, the cryptococcal meningitis. And this had, in the past, not very good treatment. The treatment we were giving patients was also toxic and also contributing to death of the patients. But this recent study, which you'll find in the New England Journal, funded by EDCTP, and this is like just a €5 million grant, has produced this single-dose liposomal amphotericin B, which is WHO has recommended as a safer drug that national programs should inherit. And coming to other infectious diseases, neglected infectious diseases, I want to give this example of bilharzia. So for those of you who have suffered from bilharzia before, or you know a friend or a patient who has suffered from bilharzia, again, you go in there, they prove you have bilharzia, you have to stand on a scale, and then according to your weight, we give you this praziquantel at the 40 milligram per kilo dose. And usually one tablet is like a bullet of KF-47, yeah. And so when you go down to schools to do mass administration of praziquantel to eradicate, it starts to become a problem, because then you have to break the tablets according to the weight of the children, and the weight of the children varies a lot in primary school and including in under 5 clinics, that it starts to become very impossible. Once you hammer that tablet, it fragments into 20 pieces. You can't even tell what is the weight of 2-3 fragments. So again, we have had to span some studies, and this study done in Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya has led to the pediatric formulated praziquantel to be properly studied, and now countries like Kenya have already given Merck a go-ahead to start local manufacturing of these drugs, which also leads into another subject of how clinical research can benefit research and development and economic development in general. And then we can't leave the stage without talking about malaria vaccine. So the RTSS vaccine that is in circulation now after so many piloting studies in under 5 clinics was also in part supported by EDCTP because the studies were done in some EDCTP supported sites. But now we have a fully funded EDCTP project on our 21 matrix vaccine, which also has shown to have good efficacy, and it looks like price-wise it will be much better than our TSS vaccine. And some of you may have seen this already in the Lancet, and the BBC also had a program on this study because it's the University of Oxford that is a sponsor of this trial, but funded by EDCTP in Burkina Faso. So again, they're making very big strides. Malaria in pregnancy is still a problem, and there is need for really improved research because, as you know, the basic drug for treating malaria in pregnancy or prevention of malaria in pregnancy was a safer drug called Fansidar, or sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, which pregnant women started to take in the first trimester, and they took 3 doses just until the last one close to delivery. But due to resistance around the world, this drug is failing programs. So there is need to find more drugs. As you can see, this is an EDCTP funded program. I'm highlighting this because some of the studies are not always successful like the ones I've presented, but these failing studies sometimes point you to new directions of how to do things. So it's a game of winning or losing in terms of whatever you look at. You can say we lost money, but we gained in knowledge. And so what is more important? I think here knowledge is more important, that we know that what you've been using or what we thought would work doesn't really work in whatever combination. So we need to go on and study more. Now, as you know, epidemics, as I said, are always ravaging, and we need to be vigilant with partners to find better vaccines for these, especially hemorrhagic diseases. And here I give an example of an EDCTP-funded study that has supported very well the development of Ebola vaccines, and these studies were done are still in progress in West Africa, and you can find them in those publications. But the work still continues, and now we have Mpox. So you saw EDCTP launching an emergency call for a 2-week application and review and funding deadline so that we can see what we can do against such. And I think we are in an era where we will see so many of these. But what is important is for a trial like this that has taken many years in one area and building capacities of all the research components you need, genomics, other human sciences and community mobilization, etc., that can stay and be utilized as platforms for continued fight against newer or re-emerging diseases. So such a trial is something that gives us hope that you can call upon them in future in West Africa and say, look, can you also do something about Lassa fever, which we are working with now with CEPI in West Africa. But I'll just give that as an example for future use of capacities built. Now, talking about capacities, one of the issues I mentioned in the slide of the areas that the previous system overlooked was really strengthening the systems in place. And what EDCTP has done is to see what can make the clinical trials be really difficult to conduct. And as you can see on this slide, without having an African clinical trial register is not a good strategy. So we established what we call Pan-African Clinical Trial Registry way back in 2009 or thereabouts, and now it's a WHO accredited clinical trial registry sitting at the Medical Research Council Cochrane Center in Cape Town. And why should you register your trials if you're doing trials in Africa in this register, not cdc.gov or a European register or Australian register? Is that for you to have your policymakers and scientists and regulators or ethics people to interact and have specific actions with the register, it needs to respond to their local needs. And if we have our own local register, this was our thinking, we can influence that. We can influence the register so that the users, the end users, get the most out of it. And indeed, it has happened. The SADC region here has had so many meetings with this register just to talk about HIV, which they couldn't do with cdc.gov. And I'm not sure the cdc.gov will welcome a contingent from Africa that they have questions about the studies that they were registered. I'm not sure whether they have that strategy, but I'm giving that as an example of how this has worked for us. And the register is part of the discussions when we are talking about how to bring together all the components of what we call clinical trial ecosystem in Africa that I'm going to talk about later. I'm not sure if we invited FDA or others or the other registers, or cdc.gov, they would come to an African meeting to discuss about how to strengthen clinical trials from registration to implementation, because they were not set up to save Africa like that. But we have our own register now, and things can change. So anybody like yourselves, if we give you the link or contacts, you can, if you have questions about clinical trial registration, you are free, because this is your own register, to go to it and interact with them. And that takes me to the issue of supporting regulators in the form of a group. So you have heard about the African Vaccine Regulators Forum, and for EDCTP's experience to interact with this group was when the RTSS vaccine was being discussed, and regulators from different countries came together with the help of WHO, and EDCTP provided funding to help them to think about ways of doing what we call joint reviews. So that when you have a protocol that covers many countries, weak and strong, the regulators can meet together and share experiences, and the weak regulators can learn from strong regulators of what the protocol means. And this complexity that others are seeing is not something that is unsurmountable. They can go back home and make a decision and approve the research within no time. So AVRF is really key for us, and we still support AVRF. So that all the regulators in Africa is our aim. They should be part of AVRF and share common standards and views. The same applies to ethics committees. I like this picture because this was one of the early pictures I took in a country where I went to see an ethics committee. And I was late to an office where the committee was just 2 people, and the other guy was sitting in front of these protocols, and he says he is ready to send these to reviewers. He was just waiting for the principal secretary of health to give him the funding to do that so that the courier can take them. But this is how he ran the ethics committee. And so transforming these committees to change all this into digital information and making sure they have enough space for review, etc., requires funding. And EDCTP has invested quite a lot in supporting national ethics committees, as I'll mention later. And that takes me to, okay, you can have a developed system, but behind them, there need to be people that have been well capacitated. And here, I talked about scientists, a critical mass of scientists that the previous systems overlooked. It's still a gap. So WHO tells us that their statistics show that African countries have 7 full-time equivalent researchers per million population compared to 400 or 500 per million population in the West. If you take that ratio as a gold standard, then we are many tens of times behind them. But that's not the issue. It's not about comparison, but looking at the burden that we have, we should be probably be talking that we need 1,000 full-time equivalent researchers per million population because of the burden that I presented earlier on. Our burden of disease and problems need more than that. So building future leaders is really critical. And this is where with ICGEB, I'm glad that one area that we really think alike is building fellowships, because these fellows add on to the pool of leaders that we need to start forming battalions and armies that position themselves ready to attack all these diseases that are still ravaging our continent. So EDCTP has developed in the last 20 years about 400 of fellows at different levels, and they are on one platform. We call it EDCTP alumni, and they're divided in disease groups, and yeah, so they work together, etc., etc. And we do have now a funders group, which ICGB is part of, discussing on how we can bring different fellows from different programs funded by different funders to start speaking to each other, because that is what is important. And we have done so at institutional level in Africa by forming what we call regional networks of excellence of EDCTP, as you can see on this map. That East Africa has its own network of institutions, South Africa the same, Central Africa likewise, and West Africa the same, which can be a platform for sharing science and strategizing. Now, publications is one of the key performance indicators we also use to see that the work we have funded is producing bodies of knowledge. And this is just an example of the statistics from our last 10 years, over 1,000 publications, which have been published mostly in 3 journals, as you can see here. The International Journal of Infectious Diseases, +1 Clinical Infectious Diseases are the most popular for EDCTP funded work. But what is important to also note is that 93% of these high impact journals are in high impact journals. I think this is very important for academic advancement, and I think most of these are also authored by a good balance of African versus Western collaborators. Again, we cannot nowadays leave the stage without talking about One Health. So EDCTP, again, has to had within the last 20 years to reposition itself into being a partner in One Health as well. So as I said, in EDCTP3 now, there is a component of climate change and very strong component of epidemic preparedness and epidemic response. Here, I just give you one of the publications which you link on if you have time when you get the slides of one of the epidemic preparedness network called Pandora ID-NATE Consortium that published their work and their vision in the Lancet. Now, again, the theme of developing women in science becomes very strong when we are doing our work. It's very easy to forget about the importance of such when you're caught up into an emergency to do something because our burden of the problem is high. But we do keep a track on looking at how are the females doing in all our work. So as you can see, in general, about 40% of our projects that we fund by EDCTP are led by women, which is not a bad ratio at all. If we can go even higher, that would be much appreciated, but it needs good surveillance and good strategies. Now, I talked about support to ethics and regulatory boards. This map just shows the countries that have received EDCTP support in the past. Some of them have gotten more than once. But this is really something that is very important, because we cannot do clinical research without protection of human subjects in terms of the quality of the research product, which regulators look at, but in terms of also dignity, safety, and human rights, which the ethics people look at. So we take this very seriously as well. And in some of these projects, there's very good north-south links where the ethics committees or boards are also being mentored by partners in the West, and vice versa, because this is a both-way learning process that the Western partners have to learn the changing landscape of ethics in Africa if they are going to participate well in what is happening. And that takes us to the issue of pharmacovigilance, which is also very important. And EDCTP funded 3 consortia to set the scene in terms of looking at how pharmacovigilance can be conducted, especially when you look at new products coming into the market. So now, as I said, we have these new drugs for children, malaria, and then we have new vaccines, etc., etc. Again, we could get lost into just saying we are delivering things, but on a large scale, how are they performing? How are the populations safe? Africa has a huge genetic diversity from west to east, north to south. People are just genetically different. If you do a clinical trial in one corner of the continent, it doesn't mean that it will work. The drug will work perfectly well like it did in a trial in Southern Africa, in West Africa. So there's really need good surveillance that needs to be done on a continued basis, and such programs, like you've seen here, one of the projects called Pavia had produced a blueprint on how pharmacovigilance systems can be set up in resource-poor settings like Africa. These are lessons that needs to be taken even further to other countries where the research was not done, to see how they can be beneficial. Now, partnerships is a big theme, and it has been at the center of EDCTP strategy to be a good partner, equitable partner with what is already going on and what is new. So here I'm just going to, quickly run through some of the examples that you probably already know. GLOPIDAR, which is a group of funders that initially received funding to have a secretariat to coordinate funders in epidemic work. So EDCTP is part of this group. And when it comes to supporting principles of equitable partnerships and capacity development, there's a group called Essence, and EDCTP is also part of this group. And some of you may have seen a lot of guidelines that they produce. And being in partnerships is also important when you bring in product developers, because that now puts everything on the map of what is being developed out there. As a scientist, I also get caught up in this problem that sometimes I don't really understand when people talk about malaria vaccines. Who is developing a vaccine? At what stage are they? How many are they? And how many have dropped off at a particular stage? So this work is really important, and I'm just giving this example where EDCTP also funded University of Amsterdam to bring together global partners developing TB vaccines to develop a global TB vaccine roadmap, which WHO has inherited. The same can be done for malaria drugs, malaria vaccine, epidemics, preparedness, etc., etc. And all what we're doing is also generating new information. And in this age where we are all appeal to have things on open access, the question is, what do we do? So what EDCTP has done to its part is to have an open portal where the protocols and data from the research that it funds is in one portal and it's the University of Oxford that runs this. So when you have time, you have the slides, you can click on that link and see how the portal looks like. And now we are lucky also that in terms of reinforcing our work, we have the World Health Assembly resolution, which was passed in 2022 by the health ministers after the experience with COVID of really promoting coordination at a continental level. And WHO is getting EDCTP funding to have these global consultations. And for us, what is important is the African consultation that has been really advanced. And now we have our own thinking with the partners, AUDA-NEPAD, Africa CDC, WHO-AFRO, etc., of what the clinical trial ecosystem in Africa looks like and how it should not be a copy and paste of whatever happens out there, but to reinforce what we think can work for us. And we had a chance to present this in Geneva at the global consultation in October last year, convincingly. And so we are now in EDCTP3, as I said. This is a new program, a little bit complex in terms of its composition, but very simple when you get it explained. And I have the links there where people can go to if they want more information about EDCTP. I think what we need to be thinking about is how do we move forward to build on already what has been built. And that is my appeal. And that's why I said in my opening, if you're interested in this seminar, that means you are already somebody who is an interested party and somebody who is already contributing. And the question should be, what should we do together? And how can we do it so that we form a stronger force? So the picture you're seeing now is the African countries as they are in EDCTP3, who are eligible to get EDCTP funding. There are more joining. And so you can look at the countries and see where you work and how that country is positioned at this stage, and look at the opportunities that can. So I would like really to end with a summary of looking at this picture again. I think we can do much better than this, and it really requires a certain type of actions for us to do even much better. And I think the EDCTP contribution has been possible because of these 5 points, that it has aligned with global and African continental priorities. It has depended on fostering equitable partnerships. So the African member states and European member states in the partnership are a one-to-one voting members, and everyone listens to each other. And they plan together, they lose together, they win together. Thirdly, it has been a program that has targeted local relevant capacity development in institutions, systems, and people. And fourthly, it is a program that has brought a strong South-South collaboration principle, which has been neglected by so many programs before. And these, once they are built, then they can be used by any other program that thinks that South-South cooperation is not on their agenda. So that's the principle of working together. And lastly, EDCTP has worked very closely with product development partners, that's industry, PDPs, to reach where we are. We wouldn't have been part of the RTSS vaccine development if we didn't work with GSK. We wouldn't be part of the ARV drugs development if we didn't work with the product developers. So it is a game of being together as a unit. And I will stop there. I've taken 10 minutes more. Thanks very much for giving me an opportunity, and very happy to be part of the debate or take questions.